They said the loneliest sound in the West wasn't the wind across the desert. It was the silence of a man who had lived too long without another voice. In the dry frontier town of Dust Hollow, where the sun bleached the wooden storefronts and the nearest railroad lay almost 80 miles away, people had grown used to strange things. Long droughts, quiet winters, riders passing through without names. But on that particular afternoon, something happened that even the oldest ranchers would remember for the rest of their lives. It started with a small platform in the middle of the town square and a crowd that gathered more out of curiosity than excitement. Dust curled through the air like slow smoke as boots shifted and horses stamped beside the hitching rails. A traveling trader stood beside the platform, wiping sweat from his neck with a red handkerchief while muttering about his final item for sale. Most of the townsfolk expected livestock, maybe a saddle horse or a crate of tools. Instead, standing quietly beneath the harsh Arizona sunlight was a young Apache woman. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply stood there with calm, steady eyes that seemed to look past the crowd rather than at it. Her long dark hair moved slightly in the dry breeze, and the simple woven dress she wore carried the colors of the desert hills. Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered. A few turned away altogether. No one stepped forward. The trader cleared his throat and tried to sound confident as he announced the offer. The last Apache girl traveling with his caravan, healthy, capable, and ready to work. Still, the square remained quiet. The truth was that Dust Hollow had learned long ago that trouble often followed anything connected to the Apache tribes in the surrounding mountains. Buying cattle was simple. Buying land was easier. But buying a human life, even in those rough frontier days, carried a weight most people preferred to avoid. The trader called out a price anyway, though his voice cracked slightly in the dry air. A few men laughed awkwardly. One rancher spat into the dust and shook his head. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. Then a voice came from the back of the crowd, calm and low enough that people had to turn to see who spoke. "I will take her." Heads turned slowly. The man stepping forward wore a faded brown coat and a wide hat that shaded most of his face. Several people recognized him immediately, and murmurs moved through the crowd like a quiet ripple across water. Caleb Walker, the cowboy who lived nearly 20 miles outside town. The one who rarely spoke to anyone. The one who had spent nearly a decade alone on a weather-beaten ranch surrounded by miles of empty desert. Most people in Dust Hollow believed Caleb preferred it that way. Some claimed he had once been different. Others said loneliness had simply become his way of life. Caleb walked toward the platform with slow, steady steps, boots pressing softly into the dust, as if he had already made his decision long before arriving in town that day. The trader blinked in surprise and repeated the price, clearly expecting hesitation. Caleb didn't hesitate. He simply reached into his coat, counted out a few worn bills, and placed them in the trader's hand. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. The Apache girl lifted her eyes and studied the quiet cowboy who had just purchased her freedom or perhaps her future. Caleb met her gaze only briefly before turning toward the road leading out of town. By the time the murmuring crowd found its voice again, the loneliest cowboy in the territory had already begun the long ride back to the silent ranch where, for the first time in years, he would not be alone. The road out of Dust Hollow stretched across the desert like a pale ribbon fading into the distance, and by the time the town disappeared behind them, the afternoon sun had already begun to lean toward the western hills. Caleb Walker rode in silence as he always did, the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves echoing softly across the dry ground. Beside him, riding a smaller chestnut mare the trader had provided, the Apache woman sat straight and quiet, her eyes scanning the open land with calm awareness. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 miles. The desert carried its own voice anyway, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the distant cry of a hawk circling high above, the creak of leather saddles shifting with each step of the horses. Caleb was not a man who believed in filling silence with unnecessary words. For nearly 9 years, the only sounds around his ranch had been cattle moving through pasture, wind brushing against wooden fence posts, and the occasional storm rolling down from the distant mountains. People in Dust Hollow often said Caleb Walker had chosen solitude the way other men chose a trade. It was simply the life he had settled into. The woman riding beside him watched him carefully, though she did not make it obvious. She had expected many things when the cowboy raised his hand in the town square. She had expected orders, demands, perhaps questions meant to test her obedience. Yet since leaving the town limits, he had done nothing except ride steadily toward the empty horizon. After another mile, Caleb slowed his horse near a shallow creek where cottonwood trees cast narrow shadows across the water. The small stream was little more than 20 feet wide, but in this part of Arizona, it was enough to keep a ranch alive. Caleb stepped down from his saddle and tied the reins loosely to a branch, then filled a small metal cup from the flowing water. He held the cup out toward the woman without speaking. She studied the gesture for a moment before accepting it. The water was cool and clear, and for the first time since leaving Dust Hollow she allowed herself to drink slowly. Caleb did not watch her while she drank. Instead he crouched near the bank and splashed water across his hands and face, the sunlight catching the droplets as they fell back into the creek. When he finally stood again, he spoke his first words since the town square, his voice quiet but steady. "My name is Caleb Walker." The woman lowered the cup and looked at him carefully. "Ayanna," she replied after a brief pause. Her voice carried the calm strength of someone used to speaking only when words mattered. Caleb nodded once, as if the simple exchange had settled something important. "The ranch is about 12 miles from here," he said. "There is a small house and a barn. Enough water for cattle and horses." His words were plain and practical, the way a rancher described land rather than people. Ayanna waited, expecting more explanation, but Caleb had already turned toward his horse again. The ride continued as the sun dipped lower and the desert slowly changed color, turning from pale gold to deep copper beneath the evening sky. As the first distant outline of a lonely ranch house appeared against the open land, Ayanna realized something unusual about the man who had bought her in Dust Hollow. He did not ride like someone returning home with a possession. He rode like a man bringing a guest into a place that had forgotten what it meant to welcome anyone at all. The ranch stood alone beneath a sky turning slowly violet with evening, its weathered wooden walls catching the last thin lines of sunlight that stretched across the desert floor. Caleb Walker rode ahead through the open gate without ceremony, his horse stepping calmly across the packed dirt yard as though returning to a place that had not seen change in many years. The small ranch house sat near a stand of cottonwood trees beside a narrow stream that curved through the land like a silver thread. Ayanna followed several steps behind, guiding the chestnut mare through the gate while studying everything with quiet attention. The place felt different from Dust Hollow. There was no noise of wagons, no voices, no restless movement of a crowded town. Only wind moving softly through dry grass and the slow creak of a barn door swaying against its hinges. Caleb dismounted first and loosened the saddle from his horse before leading the animal toward a wooden rail beside the barn. He moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had repeated the same routine every day for years. Ayanna slid from her saddle and landed lightly on the ground, her boots pressing into the dust that had likely not been disturbed by another visitor for a long time. She watched him work for a moment. There was nothing hurried about the man. No sharp commands. No sign that he felt uncomfortable with her presence. Caleb finished securing the horses before turning toward the ranch house and stepping onto the small wooden porch. The boards creaked beneath his weight as he pushed the door open and disappeared inside. Ayanna remained in the yard, unsure whether she was expected to follow or wait. A few moments later Caleb returned carrying a small iron lantern and a simple key. He stepped down from the porch and walked toward her, the lantern light beginning to glow faintly as the sun slipped below the hills. "The house is yours. Tonight," he said calmly, placing the key in her hand. "I will sleep in the barn." Ayanna looked down at the key resting against her palm. For a moment she did not move. In Dust Hollow she had watched the way men looked at her on the platform, as if they were measuring what use she might serve. But Caleb Walker stood several feet away now, his posture relaxed and his expression quiet. "You do not need to stand outside," he added. "There is food on the table and blankets near the fireplace." The words sounded more like a host speaking to a traveler than a man speaking to someone he had purchased. Ayanna studied his face carefully, searching for the hidden intention she expected to find. Instead, she saw only the tired calm of a man who had spent too many years speaking mostly to the wind. "Why did you buy me?" she asked quietly. Caleb paused, as though the answer were not a simple one. The lantern light flickered across his face while he considered the question. "I did not buy you," he said at last. "I paid the trader so you would not belong to him." The difference rested in the air between them like a small but powerful truth. Caleb nodded once toward the house before turning away and walking toward the barn without another word. Ayanna remained in the yard holding the lantern and the key, listening to the soft sound of his boots fading into the quiet evening. For the first time since the town square, she realized that the lonely rancher who had brought her here might not be the man everyone in Dust Hollow believed him to be. The desert night settled slowly across the ranch, bringing with it the quiet kind of darkness that only wide, open land could hold. Inside the small house, Ayanna stood near the wooden table where Caleb had left a simple meal of bread, beans, and a tin cup of cool water. The lantern rested beside her, its warm light casting soft shadows across the rough walls of the room. Everything inside the house looked plain but carefully kept. A small iron stove stood near the fireplace, a stack of split firewood leaned neatly beside the wall, and a worn blanket had been folded across the back of a chair as if waiting for a guest, who had not arrived for many years. Ayanna moved slowly through the room, her steps quiet against the wooden floorboards. She touched nothing at first. Instead, she studied the space the way a traveler studies unfamiliar land, noticing small details that told the story of the man who lived here. A pair of boots rested beside the door, cleaned and placed side by side. A saddle blanket hung from a hook near the window, patched but strong. Everything had a place. Everything had been cared for. After a moment, she placed the lantern on the table and stepped toward the fireplace where a small shelf held a few personal belongings. There was a tin cup, a folded map of the Arizona territory, and beside it something that made her pause. A necklace. The leather cord had darkened with age, and hanging from it was a small turquoise stone wrapped in silver wire. Ayanna felt her breath slow as she lifted it gently into the lantern light. The stone carried markings she recognized instantly, not carved by traders or settlers, but shaped in the old Apache style passed down through families for generations. She turned the necklace carefully between her fingers, studying the worn edges of the silver and the way the leather had been tied in a pattern known only to certain clans. The room suddenly felt smaller around her. Outside, the faint sound of a horse shifting inside the barn drifted through the open window along with the soft rustle of wind moving across the cottonwood leaves. Ayanna held the necklace closer to the lantern, her eyes narrowing slightly as memory stirred somewhere deep within her thoughts. This was not something a trader would carry. This was not something a cowboy would find by accident in the desert. The stone belonged to someone who understood the old ways. She lowered the necklace slowly and looked toward the dark doorway leading outside, where the barn stood nearly 50 yards away across the quiet yard. For a moment she considered walking out there and asking the question forming in her mind. But instead she placed the necklace back exactly where she had found it. The silence inside the house returned, broken only by the faint crackle of the lantern flame. Ayanna sat at the table and ate slowly, her thoughts moving carefully through the strange pieces of the puzzle surrounding the quiet cowboy who had brought her here. Caleb Walker had said he did not buy her. He had said he only paid so she would not belong to someone else. Yet the necklace resting on that shelf suggested something more complicated than simple kindness. It suggested a story that had begun long before the town square in Dust Hollow. Outside in the barn, Caleb moved quietly among the horses, unaware that the small turquoise stone inside his house had already begun to change the way the Apache woman saw him. Morning arrived quietly across the desert, the pale gold light of sunrise stretching over the dry hills and rolling slowly across the empty pasture around Caleb Walker's ranch. Ayanna woke before the sun cleared the horizon, the habit of early mornings long practiced among her people. The small house still held the warmth of the lantern that had burned through part of the night, though its flame had faded to a faint glow. For a moment she remained seated at the wooden table, listening to the soft silence that surrounded the ranch. No voices, no distant wagons, only the quiet breathing of the land itself. Then she heard the first sound of the day, a horse shifting in the barn, boots moving across wooden boards. Caleb was already awake. Ayanna stepped outside into the cool air just as the first full line of sunlight reached the cottonwood trees beside the stream. The ranch looked different in daylight. What had seemed lonely in the dark now appeared steady and practical, built by a man who understood how to survive in a place where comfort was never guaranteed. The barn stood solid and well repaired. The fences stretched across several acres of grazing land, and beyond them the open desert rolled outward for miles without interruption. Caleb stood near the water trough, filling a metal bucket, while two horses waited patiently nearby. He noticed her approach, but did not appear surprised. "Morning," he said simply. His voice carried the same quiet steadiness it had the night before. Ayanna stopped a few steps away and studied him again in the clear light of day. Caleb Walker did not move like a man hiding something. Yet the necklace on the shelf inside the house had already told her that there were parts of his life he had not spoken about. "You wake early," she said. "Ranch work does not wait for the sun," Caleb replied, pouring water into the trough. The horses lowered their heads to drink while he rested the bucket against the fence rail. Ayanna watched the simple routine for a moment before asking the question that had stayed in her mind through the night. "The necklace in your house?" Caleb paused. "Only slightly, but long enough for the moment to become noticeable." The horses continued drinking while the quiet desert air settled around them. "It belongs to someone who helped me a long time ago," he answered finally. His tone remained calm, though his eyes had turned briefly toward the distant hills before returning to her. "Someone from my people," Ayanna said. Caleb nodded once. "Yes." The answer did not carry surprise, only acknowledgement. Ayanna stepped closer, the early sunlight catching the dark strands of her hair as the breeze moved gently through the yard. "The stone is from a family line that lives near the northern mountains," she said carefully. "Only certain women make them that way." Caleb listened without interrupting. "The woman who gave it to you," Ayanna continued, her voice quieter now. "She must have trusted you." Caleb rested his hand against the wooden rail of the fence, his expression thoughtful but not defensive. "Trust was the only thing she offered me," he said, "and it saved my life." The words hung quietly between them as the morning wind stirred the dry grass beyond the pasture. Ayanna studied his face again, this time with a different kind of attention. The puzzle that had begun with a necklace was growing larger with every answer. Somewhere in Caleb Walker's past was a moment that connected him to her people, a moment strong enough that he had carried the turquoise stone for years. And now, standing in the morning light of a ranch far from Dust Hollow, she began to understand that her arrival here might not have been a coincidence at all. The sun climbed higher above the desert hills, warming the wide stretch of land that surrounded Caleb Walker's ranch, and the quiet rhythm of the morning slowly settled into the work of the day. Caleb moved through the pasture repairing a section of fence where the dry wind had loosened two wooden rails during the night. The simple sound of hammer against nail echoed lightly across the open land, steady and patient, the way every task on a ranch had to be done if the land was going to remain alive. Ayanna stood near the stream washing a tin cup in the clear water, but her attention remained fixed on the man working beside the fence. Since sunrise, she had watched him carefully, measuring every movement the way her people were taught to read the world around them. Caleb Walker carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to the land he worked on, yet there was something else beneath that calm routine, something that connected him to a story he had only begun to reveal. When Caleb finished driving the last nail into place, he rested his hammer against the fence post and turned toward the stream. Ayanna was already waiting, the cup placed upside down on a flat stone beside the water. The morning breeze carried the scent of dry grass and distant mountains while the two of them stood a few steps apart in the quiet sunlight. "You said the woman saved your life," Ayanna said after a moment. Caleb nodded slowly. "Many years ago, before this ranch, before Dust Hollow." His voice carried a distant tone now, as if the memory lived somewhere far beyond the desert horizon. Ayanna folded her arms lightly and waited. Among her people, silence was often the invitation for truth. Caleb stepped closer to the stream and crouched near the edge, running his fingers through the cool water before continuing. "I was traveling alone then," he said. "I had nothing except a tired horse and a few dollars in my pocket. I crossed into the mountains without understanding that the winter storms had already begun there." He paused briefly, the faint ripple of water moving across the surface of the stream. "I became lost. The snow came early that year." Ayanna listened carefully, her expression calm but attentive. The mountains he described lay north of the territory, where Apache families moved through hidden valleys during the cold months. Someone found you, she said quietly. Caleb nodded again. A woman from your people. She found me when I could barely stand. She brought me to a small camp where her family was staying for the winter. They gave me water and food and a place near their fire until the storm passed. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a memory that had stayed with him for many years. Ayanna studied his face again, searching for something deeper inside the story. And the necklace, she asked. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and removed the leather cord he had taken from the house earlier that morning. The turquoise stone caught the sunlight as he held it between his fingers. When I left the mountains, he said, she placed this in my hand. She told me that kindness is a debt the desert never forgets. Ayanna felt a quiet realization forming in her mind as she looked at the stone again. Among her people, such a gift was never given lightly. It meant trust. It meant memory. Sometimes it even meant a promise carried forward into the future. Caleb slipped the necklace back into his pocket and stood again, the breeze lifting the edges of his coat as the desert day continued to unfold around them. For years he had carried the small turquoise stone without knowing that one morning it would lead him back to someone connected to the very people who had once saved him. The desert afternoon stretched long and quiet across Caleb Walker's ranch, the sunlight turning the distant hills a soft copper color while the wind moved slowly through the dry grass beyond the fence line. For a while neither Caleb nor Ayanna spoke after his story ended. The stream continued its gentle movement beside them, carrying thin reflections of the bright sky across the shallow water. Ayanna stood with her hands resting lightly at her sides, her thoughts moving carefully through the pieces of what she had just heard. Among her people, stories like the one Caleb described were never treated as small things. When a life was saved, the memory of that moment did not fade with time. It traveled through families, carried in words, objects, and quiet promises that could last for many years. Ayanna finally lifted her eyes toward the distant northern horizon where the mountains lay far beyond the desert plains. The woman who helped you, she said slowly, do you remember her name? Caleb shook his head gently. She spoke little English, and I knew only a few words of her language. We shared the fire and the winter storm, but not many words. Ayanna considered this answer, her gaze thoughtful rather than doubtful. Among the Apache, names were sometimes protected the same way sacred places were protected. A person could know kindness without knowing every detail behind it. She stepped closer to the stream and crouched beside the water, letting her fingers trail across the cool surface as she spoke again. The stone you carry was made by a woman from the Red Mesa clan, she said. Only they wrapped turquoise and silver that way. Caleb listened carefully. The name meant little to him, yet he understood that it was important to her. The woman who helped me wore a necklace almost the same as this one, he replied. Ayanna looked up from the water, the faint breeze lifting a strand of her dark hair across her cheek. Then there is something you should know, she said quietly. Caleb waited. The calm tone of her voice carried the weight of a truth that had been building since the night before. The woman who made stones like that, Ayanna continued, was my mother. The words settled into the quiet air between them like a stone placed carefully upon the ground. Caleb did not speak immediately. The idea moved slowly through his mind as the meaning of her statement unfolded. Your mother helped me in those mountains, he said after a moment, his voice softer than before. Ayanna nodded once. She told stories about the winter when she saved a man who was lost in the snow. A man who carried the stubborn spirit of someone who refused to give up even when the storm closed around him. Caleb felt the memory return more clearly now, the faint image of a warm fire inside a small shelter of pine branches, the calm face of a woman who had spoken gently while the storm passed outside the camp. I never knew what became of her after I left the mountains, he admitted. Ayanna rose slowly to her feet, the sunlight catching the quiet strength in her expression. She returned to her people and raised her family, she said. She taught us that sometimes the desert brings strangers together for reasons we do not understand until many years later. Caleb looked at the turquoise stone resting inside his coat pocket, realizing that the long road that had begun in a winter storm had finally circled back to a place he never expected to stand again. The afternoon drifted quietly toward evening after Ayanna revealed the truth about her mother, and the ranch seemed to breathe with a different rhythm now that the hidden thread between their lives had finally been spoken aloud. Caleb spent the next hours moving through the routine tasks that kept the land alive, checking the water flow in the irrigation ditch and guiding a small group of cattle toward the shaded pasture near the stream. Ayanna walked beside him for part of the work, learning the shape of the land the way her people always learned a new place, by watching the path of water, the direction of the wind, and the silent patterns left by animals crossing the dust. The ranch covered nearly 40 acres of rough but steady ground, and by the time the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, the two of them had circled most of it without speaking much at all. It was not the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was the calm quiet of two people who had begun to understand the strange road that had brought them together. Caleb was repairing a loose gate near the far edge of the pasture when he noticed something that made him pause. At first it was only a faint movement along the distant ridge nearly half a mile away. A thin ribbon of dust rising slowly into the sky. Out here, dust meant movement, and movement usually meant riders. Caleb rested his hand against the wooden post and studied the horizon carefully. The dust cloud widened slightly as it moved along the ridge, too steady to be wild horses and too controlled to be a wandering cattle herd. Riders. More than one. Ayanna followed his gaze and saw it as well. She did not look surprised. Instead, she shaded her eyes with her hand and watched the distant shapes forming slowly against the glowing sky. They are not from Dust Hollow, she said quietly. Caleb nodded. The riders moved with a kind of discipline that town men rarely carried. They rode in a long, loose line that kept equal distance between each horse, their path steady as they descended from the ridge toward the open valley below. The evening light turned the dust around them a pale orange color as they approached, their figures growing clearer with each passing minute. Caleb counted them silently. 10, then 20. By the time the riders reached the valley floor, there were far more than that. Ayanna lowered her hand slowly as recognition settled into her expression. My people travel that way, she said softly. Caleb looked at her. Do they know you are here? Ayanna considered the question before answering. My father has searched for me since the traders took me from the caravan road. News travels fast across the desert when families are waiting. The riders continued moving closer, their horses crossing the open land with calm purpose rather than urgency. From the ranch yard, they would soon be visible to anyone standing near the house or the barn. Caleb rested his hands on the top rail of the gate and watched them approach, the quiet understanding of the moment settling over him like the cool air that followed sunset. Ayanna stood beside him, the wind lifting the edges of her dark hair while the approaching riders slowly filled the horizon. By the time the sun disappeared completely behind the distant hills, the empty land around Caleb Walker's lonely ranch would no longer belong to silence alone. The riders reached the valley floor just as the last light of day faded from the desert sky, their horses moving with the calm rhythm of travelers who had crossed many miles with a clear purpose. From the ranch gate, Caleb and Ayanna watched the long line approach across the open land, the quiet thunder of hooves carrying softly through the evening air. The riders did not rush the final stretch toward the ranch. Instead, they slowed as they reached the stream, guiding their horses across the shallow water before forming a wide circle several yards from the fence line. In the fading twilight, the group became easier to count. There were nearly 40 of them, each rider dressed in the simple travel clothes of the Apache people, their presence steady and disciplined beneath the darkening sky. Caleb remained where he stood beside the gate, his hands resting calmly on the wooden rail. He had lived in the desert long enough to understand that fear was not the language spoken in moments like this. Respect was. Ayanna stepped forward a few paces, the wind lifting the edge of her dress as she looked toward the front of the riders. One man guided his horse slowly ahead of the others, his posture straight and deliberate as he approached the fence. The lantern light from the ranch house reached just far enough to reveal the calm strength in his face. When he stopped his horse, he looked first at Ayanna, and the quiet relief that crossed his expression told a story older than any words spoken that evening. My daughter, he said gently. Ayanna walked toward the fence until she stood a few steps from him, her voice carrying across the still air. Father. The single word settled over the land like the final piece of a long journey falling into place. For a moment, neither of them moved, the years of searching and waiting ending in a silence that spoke louder than celebration. The riders behind him watched quietly, their horses standing calm beneath them as the evening wind brushed across the open valley. The Apache leader finally turned his gaze toward Caleb Walker, who remained beside the gate with the steady posture of a rancher greeting travelers rather than facing strangers. The leader studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You are the man who brought my daughter here." Caleb nodded once. "I paid the trader so she would leave that road. Nothing more." The Apache leader considered the answer while the last color of sunset faded from the horizon. Then he guided his horse closer to the fence and slowly dismounted, placing one hand over his chest in a gesture of respect shared by many desert cultures. "Years ago," he said, "a woman from my family told us about a traveler who survived the winter storm because she chose to help him." Caleb felt the small weight of the turquoise necklace resting inside his coat pocket. "I remember her kindness every day," he replied quietly. The leader's eyes moved from Caleb to Ayanna and then back again, the pieces of the story finally clear beneath the rising stars. "The desert remembers kindness," he said. "My daughter told me what you did in Dust Hollow." Caleb glanced briefly toward Ayanna, who stood beside the fence watching him with the same calm strength her mother must have carried years ago in the mountains. "I only returned a debt that was never mine to keep," Caleb answered. The Apache leader allowed a faint smile to appear as the wind moved softly through the dark grass around the ranch. "Then the desert has finished its circle," he said, "and tonight it brings two paths together where there was once only one lonely road."